Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to open the PhD defense of Noemí for today. And I'm going to explain the protocol that we will follow. First of all, we are going to listen to the presentation of Noemí for 45 minutes to 1 hour. This will be then followed by a round of questions of people from the audience who own a PhD. Then we will have a speech from the directors, if they like. And then we will move to the next part of the session for today, which will be the interactions with the committee present here. So my name is Sylvain Laborde. I come from the German Sport University Cologne, Department of Performance Psychology. I will be the president of this committee. Our secretary today will be Alejandro. You can introduce yourself.
It's okay.
Okay. And then our external reviewer, Thomas Grunwald from the Medical School of Hamburg. All right. So then the procedure will be the following for the questions. Each of the committee member will ask between 20 and 30 minutes of questions. And afterwards, there will be a time where the audience will leave the room and the committee will deliberate for the question. All right. So I think we even too German because it's 2 minutes before 5. So I'm not sure if we are waiting for anyone else. Otherwise, if everything is ready, I would say we can get and start with your presentation now. All the best.
With the permission of the evaluation committee, I start the presentation of my doctoral thesis titled Detrended Fluctuation Analysis of Heart Variability for Exercise Prescription and Monitoring in Healthy and Heart Failure Populations. This thesis was directed by Dr. José Manuel Sarabia-Marín and Dr. Manuel Moya Ramón. The doctoral thesis was financially supported by the Ministerio de Ciencia e Innovación y Universidades, and I also received a research grant that I performed in the Julius Maximilians Universität of Würzburg in Germany with Professor Olaf Voss. To provide a roadmap of the presentation, I will start with a general introduction of the thesis to continue with the objectives and hypotheses of each of the studies included. Then I present the methods, results, and discussion of the studies listed on the slide, although then I will talk more about them, to continue with the limitations and conclusions of the thesis. To finish, I will provide some practical applications and future research directions. At the bottom part of the slide, to better follow the presentation, you'll find the number of the slide and the part progress of the presentation. To contextualize the work performed on the thesis, I would like to start by highlighting the importance of a proper exercise intensity determination. Why? Because we need to perform an individualized and effective prescription and monitoring to properly determine this intensity. In performance context, it is important because it is what allows an optimization of training loads that will determine the competitive success. And then in the clinical populations, it is important not only for its effectiveness, but also for safety. So that we need the proper balance between those both aspects. Normally, this exercise intensity is determined using exercise intensity domains, which are separated by the exercise thresholds, so that normally below the first threshold, we find the moderate domain, between the first and the second threshold, the heavy domain, and above the second threshold, the severe domain. And in each of these domains, we can find different behaviors of the traditionally studied physiological markers, such as it could be heart rate, oxygen uptake, or blood lactate concentration. Now, how do we determine this exercise intensity? Well, in everyday practice, that is in general population and in many clinical settings, what it is normally performed is to use fixed percentages of maximal, peak, or reserve values. This option is simple, it is low cost, and it provides immediate feedback, but on the other side, literature has shown that it produces a heterogeneous response with many non-responders to the exercise program. Conversely, when we use intensity thresholds, the response is more homogeneous, And this is why the best practice and the recommended practice is to use physiological thresholds obtained from the cardiopulmonary exercise test. Which are these thresholds normally in literature? Well, the ones that analyze the blood lactate concentration and the gas exchange. Here I show the many different methods that we can find in literature to define the first threshold and the second threshold for ventilatory thresholds, and on the right part, the thresholds, the lactate thresholds, the first and the second one. We can see that there are many different methods to determine the same points, and that they can produce some differences, so that we find a high definitional heterogeneity for defining these thresholds. This supposes method-dependent variability, intervallic differences, poor agreement between some of the methods, and even some criteria present lower reliability than others. And now that we have determined intensity, how do we monitor this intensity? Well, we know it is so important to properly monitor this intensity because it is what will ensure that the training session delivers the intended physiological stimulus, and this is due to the basic difference that we can find between what we prescribe and what it is done in the practice. We also need to reduce the risk of training too easy to elicit adaptations or too hard, that we can increase the likelihood of overtraining, injury, illness, or adverse events. Furthermore, literature has shown that individuals performing the same external workload may experience different internal stresses due to the influence of different factors such as sex, age, genetics, recovery state, psychological state, etc. And last, we know that a proper tracking of the internal load and the recovery of training is necessary for an effective management of progression and recovery. The traditional internal load markers that are used to monitor exercise intensity are the ones that I present on the slide, starting with oxygen uptake and blood lactate concentration. Both markers provide a direct insight into the metabolic stress and are considered robust domain classification markers, as I have explained before. And on the other side, we have heart rate, that is a simple option. It is non-invasive, inexpensive, and provides high temporal resolution, also not providing this direct metabolic insight. The problem is that these markers present some limitations that are widely studied in literature. The first option, the oxygen uptake, it is expensive, it requires for laboratory equipment, regular calibration, specialized personnel, and furthermore, the use of face masks that are not considered very comfortable for the practical settings like home-based programs or field programs. On the other side, the blood lactate concentration, it is also expensive. Furthermore, it requires for intermittent measures, it is invasive, and also requires for specialized personnel. That is what makes these both markers not practical for routine training, field sessions, or clinical practice. On the other side, heart rate, that we've seen that could be a simpler option and more accessible. The problem is that presents a cardiovascular drift. This is that during a constant load and prolonged session of exercise, the heart rate keeps increasing, although the external workload maintains stable. And this can decouple the heart rate from the real metabolic demand that we could obtain with the oxygenated or blood lactate measures. This cardiovascular drift is mainly associated to dehydration or increased core temperature, and it is what makes that heart rate, it is not very recommended as a standalone marker. So how can we assess then durability? Because we need an option that could be used in the practical settings. So durability, basically what tries to reflect is the time-dependent changes that increase the cost of maintaining a given output and reflects as this decoupling, this growing mismatch between two monitoring variables, normally one pair of internal and external markers, and normally heart rate with pace or power depending on the modality of exercise. Literature has shown that even at moderate intensities, we can find this cardiovascular drift. So there is a need for accessible internal load metrics that remain informative under these prolonged steady-state conditions. And here's where heart rate variability appears. heart rate variability, HRV, for now on, describes the fluctuations that we can find between the beats in the cardiac cycle, between the beats, arising from this autonomic modulation of the sinoatrial node, and it reflects the dynamic interplay between both autonomic branches. Basically, during exercise, heart rate increases and HRV decreases due to the predominance of the sympathetic branch, and during rest and recovery, heart rate decreases and HRV increases due to the predominance of the parasympathetic branch. Knowing this behavior has led to use HRV during exercise context to monitor training status and chronic adaptations and to inform day-to-day adjustment and recovery in endurance exercise. And what about clinical populations? What we should know is that clinical populations are going to have affected the HRV generally. For example, chronic heart failure, that is the population of our second study, is characterized by an increased sympathetic activation and a decrease in the vagal tone that translates into a decreased HRV. Furthermore, some of the patients are undergoing pharmacological treatment that is going to affect the HRV. For example, the angiotensin-converting enzyme inhibitors or the beta blockers have shown to restore the autonomic balance, so that reflects in an increase in HRV during rest. Due to the study, the behavior of HRV has led to get some interest in these indices to use them for intensity threshold determination. In the literature, we can find many different, or not so many, but a big sample of studies that investigate the use of these indices of time domain, frequency domain, and nonlinear indices to try to determine these thresholds, ventilatory or lactate ones. On the slide, you can see some examples also of some of the methods used, and the problem is that although they present promising results on context and population context, they are limited because they are method dependent and also context dependent. Some of the limitations that are broadly explored in literature is the loss of dynamic range, as we can see. The last slide is not working, but as we can see on the right part of the slide, there is a loss of dynamic range above the ventilatory threshold, this first threshold, so that we lose our capacity to discriminate beyond this point. There is also a respiration dependency, so that when exercise intensity keeps increasing, the breathing frequency is going to increase and produce a rapid vagal withdrawal. Most of the methods rely on visual inspection to look for breakpoints on the data that are not universally detectable between methods and between populations, so complicating then the reproducibility of the methods and the external validity of the methods. And lastly, and very important, data quality when we assess HRV data is very important because it can bias the estimates. These limitations have led to get some interest in nonlinear indices because they are not as affected by these limitations. And recently, in literature, a fractal metric, the detrended fluctuation analysis of alpha-1 index, for now on DFA alpha-1, has been proposed as an intensity biomarker. It is a dimensionless index that quantifies the fractal correlation structure of our interval dynamics. Basically, the behavior of this index ranges from values approximately of 1.5 to values approximately of 0.5. It could be a little bit higher or a little bit lower. Starting with values approximately of 1.5, they are associated with strongly correlated behavior that we can find during low-intensity exercise, during recovery, or even in some illnesses during rest. On the opposite side, or with values of 0.5, more or less, we find a random and uncorrelated or even anti-correlated behavior that is associated with high-intensity exercise. It is a sign of cardiac risk, and it is present also in some illnesses during rest. In the middle part, with values around 1, we find a fractal-like signal representing correlated behavior that is this balance between the complete predictability and the randomness. Knowing this behavior and how this index behaves has led to use it during exercise, and during incremental exercise, DFA alpha 1 has shown to decline as intensity rises due to the increase in systemic demand and the loss of fractal organization. Conceptually, this aligns with the network physiology of exercise, which considers the organization of exercise as the coordination of the different interacting physiological subsystems that keep responding to organism and environmental demands. So that a decrease in DFA alpha 1 will reflect a loss of complexity and a loss of adaptability to these internal or external demands. Based on this behavior, literature has proposed two absolute values of DFA alpha 1 as exercise thresholds. A value of 0.75 has been considered the first HRV threshold, HRV-T1, because mathematically it reflects the midpoint of the transition between correlated behavior and less correlated dynamics. And then a value of 0.5 has been associated with the second threshold of HRV, HRV-T2, because it represents the loss of correlations associated with high stress and the rupture of the correlation between the subsystems. What about constant load exercise? Well, DFA alpha 1 has been also explored and has exhibited an intensity and time-dependent behavior that also is consistent with the durability concept. Basically and schematically, what it is expected is that during low-intensity exercise, we can find high and stable DFA alpha 1 values, and as duration accumulates, the values are going to still be high, but keep decreasing a little bit. And during high-intensity exercise, DFA alpha 1 values are going to be low, and as time increases, these values will keep decreasing. Now that we know how this index behaves, I would like to highlight also the advantages that it could present for the practical use. Starting for the sensitivity that it has shown across a wide intensity range, including high intensity, that is different from other indices, for example, the time domain or frequency domain, as we have seen. Furthermore, it is an integrative and dimensionless index that reflects the balance between the autonomic and the cardiorespiratory system within this framework of a complex adaptive system, and provides more information than the traditional thresholds. It is wearable friendly, very important for real-time and retrospective analysis during field or home-based programs in the practical settings, and it is non-invasive and a low-cost option, more accessible to general populations and clinical context also. These advantages and the known behavior of the index has led to suggest it as a potential biomarker of intensity and to use it to prescribe or monitor exercise intensity during training. Due to the research gaps identified in the literature before the elaboration of this doctoral thesis, we set the next general objectives. First of all, to establish the agreement of DFA alpha 1 thresholds with both ventilatory and lactate thresholds in untrained adults, and with ventilatory thresholds in chronic heart failure patients. Then to evaluate between the reliability of DFA alpha 1 thresholds. And third, to delineate how DFA alpha 1 behaves during prolonged constant exercise across intensity domains, moderate, heavy, and severe, including its practical utility for real-time domain-based monitoring and prescription. Now I will continue with the specific objectives and hypotheses of each of the studies included in the thesis. For the first study, for study 1, the first objective was to determine the agreement between DFA alpha 1 thresholds and ventilatory and lactate thresholds in untrained healthy adults during an incremental cycling stage test. We hypothesized that both HRV thresholds will show agreement with ventilatory thresholds and lactate thresholds, with the highest agreement in power output values. And the second objective was to establish between the reliability of DFA alpha 1 thresholds in untrained healthy adults during an incremental cycling stage test. We hypothesized that both HRV thresholds will demonstrate good between the reliability in all of the variables measured. For study 2, the specific objective and hypothesis was to evaluate the agreement of DFA-alpha-1 thresholds and ventilatory thresholds in chronic heart failure patients during an incremental ramp test, where we hypothesized that the first HRV threshold will show a strong agreement with BT1, and the second HRV threshold will exhibit at least a moderate agreement with BT2. And for the third analysis study, the objectives and hypotheses were to characterize the behavior of DFA-alpha-1 during prolonged constant low cycling within the moderate, heavy, and severe domains, expecting that DFA-alpha-1 will remain high and stable in the moderate domain with values above 0.75, that in the heavy domain it will decline towards 0.75, and during the severe domain it will decline towards the 0.5 value. Then, to contextualize DFA-alpha-1 time course trajectories alongside heart rate, oxygen uptake, and blood lactate concentration, here we expected and we hypothesized that the time course of DFA-alpha-1 will cooperate in a domain-consistent inverse manner with traditional internal load markers. And the last objective, it was to evaluate the prescriptive utility of DFA-alpha-1, analyzing the percentage of time and the percentage of participants remaining within the intended domain when zones were defined using ventilatory, lactate, or HRV thresholds. We hypothesized that DFA-alpha-1 thresholds to determine intensity zones would yield high alignment with the intended domain, particularly in the moderate intensity domain, and that at heavy and severe domains, DFA-alpha-1 will present a higher inter-individual variability. Now we'll start with the methods, results, and discussion of each of the studies in study. The first study is titled Reliability and Validity of a Nonlinear Index of HRV variability to determine intensity thresholds. On the slide, you can also see the authors of the paper. And we wanted to test if the proposed method in literature was valid and reliable to apply in an untrained healthy population that had not been investigated before. For this study, we recruited healthy participants who were male and female, aged less than 18 years, and who did not practice any regular sport or follow an structured physical activity program. All of the participants performed 2 identical incremental cycling stage tests with 3-minute stages and with individualized increments. These both tests were separated by more or less 1 week, 6 to 9 days. And we measure continuously oxygen uptake, heart rate, our intervals, and power output. And we sampled at the beginning, at the end of each stage, and at the end of the test, the blood lactate concentration. With this data, we calculated ventilatory thresholds, lactate thresholds, and HRV thresholds. For ventilatory thresholds, we followed the method suggested by Kay and colleagues in 2022 that use 7 graphs with many different methods to determine ventilatory thresholds in order to increase the reliability of the estimates. For lactate thresholds, we employed XFIS LabAware application that calculates 17 different methods to determine thresholds, and we selected different methods for the first and the second lactate threshold. The first threshold, you can see it in a circle, and the second threshold in a square. Basically, the fixed blood lactate concentration of 2 and 2.5 millimoles per liter and the baseline +1 method were selected for the first lactate threshold. And for the second lactate threshold, we selected the onset of blood lactate accumulation and the baseline +1.5 method due to previous research using these methods for these thresholds, and due to practical settings also. And finally, for HRV thresholds, we imported the electrocardiogram data to Ruiz HRV Scientific, and the automatic bit correction filter was applied. Then DFA-alpha-1 was estimated in windows of 2 minutes with a recalculation every 5 seconds. To estimate DFA-alpha-1 thresholds, the method proposed by Rogers and colleagues in 2021 was applied, so that the DFA-alpha-1 data was plotted against time and against heart rate, and a linear regression was calculated between the values of 1 to approximately 0.5. Then, with the equation of this linear regression, we calculated the values at which DF in alpha 1 achieved the specific values of 0.75 and 0.5 for the first and second threshold, respectively. The time values were then converted to oxygen uptake values and power output values using an interpolation. For the statistical analysis, we employed HASP, Microsoft Excel, and G-Power. Significance was set at a p inferior to 0.05. Normality was checked with Zafiro-Wilk. The agreement was assessed with PERTI test or Wilkinson test, depending on parametric or non-parametric data. Pearson or Spearman correlations, depending on parametric or non-parametric data. The interclass correlation coefficient, and the Bland-Altman analysis. For the interpretation of the correlation coefficient, we follow Cohen 2013, and for ICC interpretation, we follow Coney and Watkins in 2009. For reliability assessment, we employed the ICC, the change in mean, and the typical error, and then we perform also post-hoc power calculations. Starting with the results, on the slide you can see the characteristics of the participants included in the study. There were 13 men and 3 women, a total of 16 participants, with a mean age of 24 and a mean maximal oxygen uptake of 49.7. Starting with the reliability results, we can highlight that the second HRV threshold exhibited the highest ICCs in oxygen uptake and power output, and they were the highest ICCs comparing also with traditional thresholds. We can find that heart rate values associated with the thresholds provided lower reliability, and this could be attributed to the variability, because also in the methods, in the ventilatory and lactate threshold methods, we could see this lower reliability with heart rate data. And to finish this part, the HRV thresholds show similar values to ventilatory threshold and lactate thresholds in the reliability results, and also comparable with previous literature, such as, for example, the article from Payares and colleagues in 2016, who compares traditional thresholds, ventilatory and lactate thresholds. Regarding agreement, the first to highlight is that the stronger agreement was achieved with power output values for all of the comparisons, for HRVT1 with ventilatory first threshold and lactate first threshold, and for HRVT2 with ventilatory second threshold and the onset of blood lactate accumulation. If we focus on the results of the comparison of the first threshold, we can see correlation coefficients higher than 0.7, although for heart rate, again, the results are lower, and ICCs also above 0.75. But if we focus on the results of HRVT2, we can see that the agreement is even stronger than with the comparison of the first threshold, with correlation coefficients above 0.88 and ICCs also above this value. What it is important is that our results also reflect the ones presented in previous literature, so that they find that external markers provide better agreement than heart rate, for example, and that the second threshold normally in some part and the vast majority part of literature has led to a better agreement than the first threshold. Why? Because there is a trend to overestimate these ventilatory and lactate thresholds in this population, especially the first threshold, the first ventilatory threshold, is overestimated with HRV methods, and although we are finding high correlations and strong correlations, is something that we have to consider also. Now, regarding the Bland-Altman analysis, we find that the limits of agreement are considered wide, but comparable to the results of this method in other articles, and also comparable to results found with the traditional methods of ventilatory and lactate thresholds. Then, at the last part of the study, the post-hoc power calculations were good and enhancing the confidence of the results achieved on the study. On the slide, you can see only an example of one of the participants and the location of each of the thresholds measured. You can see that HRVT1 and HRVT2 are located near some of the lactate methods. For example, the first method again, the first threshold again is in a circle and the second threshold in a square, but basically is to show the difference on the location between methods, but not only of HRV thresholds with ventilatory and lactate thresholds, but also between ventilatory and lactate thresholds that we can see, for example, here in the bottom part, the first ventilatory threshold and lactate thresholds associated very near to the HRV threshold, the first HRV threshold. Now I will continue with study 2, which is titled Detection of Exercise Intensity Thresholds in Patients with Chronic Heart Failure based on correlation properties of heart rate variability. Here what we wanted to do was to test if this method could be applied to cardiac populations, and in this case in chronic heart failure populations, because are the ones that have led to worse detection of ventilatory thresholds during cardiopulmonary exercise tests. For this study, we recruited patients who were male and female, aged more than 18 years, with a chronic heart failure diagnosis and an IHR class of 2 or 3, and who had been more than 3 months with stable symptoms, therapy, and medical treatment. All of the patients perform an incremental ramp test, and we continuously monitor oxygen uptake, heart rate, RI intervals, and power output, and then with this data assess the ventilatory thresholds and HRV thresholds following the same methods as for the first study. The statistical analysis for this study were also performed in HASP and Microsoft Excel with significance set at a p inferior to 0.05. Normality was checked with Zafiro wheel, and the agreement was assessed with QWERTY test or Wilkinson text, depending on parametric or non-parametric data. We calculated the mean or median difference with the 95% confidence interval, and the Pearson or Spearman correlations, depending on parametric or non-parametric data. We also calculated the ICC and the Bland-Harman analysis, and for the interpretations, we followed PET 2016 for the correlation coefficient and Porney and Watkins for the ICC. Starting with the results, 42 patients met the inclusion criteria, but 52% of these patients were excluded of the analysis because of symptom-limited CPITs, failure to identify some of the thresholds with ventilatory or with HRV method, and heart rate data artifacts exceeding the 5% allowed in heart rate variability analysis. This resulted in only 20 patients included in the study of the 42 that were recruited. These 20 patients present the demographic and clinical characteristics that we can find on the table of the slide. We included 13 male and 7 female with a mean age of 59 years and a mean peak oxygen uptake of 18.4. And some of the patients were undergoing pharmacological treatment with beta blockers or with angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors. The agreement results show that here the best agreement and the strongest agreement was achieved with VO2 values, with oxygen uptake values, with correlation coefficients about 0.77 for the first threshold and 0.28 for the second threshold. And I want to focus on the results of the second threshold comparison with HRV-2 showing a strong agreement and low mean differences that are considerably acceptable for the practice. And this is important because it supposes an advantage for this population, because normally they prescribe SSC with percentages of peak or maximal values, and this is a more individualized option than these percentages. And furthermore, we know that in these populations, high intensity training has been suggested as a very effective training for improving the cardiorespiratory fitness, for prognosis also, and it could be applied by clinicians with this method, the detection of the thresholds. And these results also show the trend of HRV-1 to overestimate VT1. And if we want to compare with previous literature, we only find one article on cardiac patients, that is from Ruiz and colleagues in 2021, who assessed the first threshold agreement. They did find better agreement results than us, but they also presented this trend of overestimating the first ventilatory threshold. Focusing on the Bland-Allman analysis on the right part of the slide, again, the limits of agreement are considered wide but comparable to those presented in the literature with traditional thresholds. And now the last and third study, study 3. It is an original paper that is under review in the European Journal of Sports Sciences. It is titled Correlation Properties of Heart Rate Variability for Exercise Intensity Monitoring and Prescription During Constant Low Cycling, Comparison with Traditional Physiological Variables. We wanted to go further from incremental exercise and also apply this variable to constant lows in the different domains and see if the behavior of these index would reflect the changes that traditional thresholds are showing. For this aim, we recruited the healthy participants with the same characteristics as for study 1. They performed 4 sessions. The first session was always an incremental cycling stage test that was identical to the incremental test of the first study. And then they performed 3 constant low sessions on the cycle ergometer, a moderate session, a heavy session, and a severe session, which were randomized and counterbalanced between participants. The moderate session was prescribed at 10% below the BT1, the heavy session halfway between BT1 and BT2, and the severe session halfway between BT2 and the peak power output. The sessions were separated by 6 to 9 days, more or less 1 week, and the maximum time permitted for the constant low sessions was 60 minutes or until exhaustion. During all the sessions, the oxygen uptake, the blood lactate concentration, the heart rate and RI intervals, and the power output was monitored and registered. And with the data of the incremental cycling stage test, we calculated the ventilatory thresholds, lactate and HRV thresholds, following the same methods as for study 1. And for the lactate thresholds, in this case, we selected the fixed blood lactate concentration of 2 and the onset of blood lactate accumulation associated with 4 millimoles per liter for the second threshold, for the first and the second lactate threshold respectively. This was done to practical settings because they are the most used on the practical context. For the analysis of this data, we use an isotime approach so that we divided the total session time or the total session time into quarters, and we analyzed the last minute of corresponding to the previous minute corresponding to each time point. Q0 represents the baseline moment, and then Q1, Q2, Q3, and Q4 correspond to the 25, 50, 75, and 100% of the total session time duration. And to assess the training zones distribution, we use 6 methods, which were the ventilatory, lactate, and HRV thresholds in the original measuring unit and in the heart rate associated with the threshold. For the statistical analysis, we employed the HASP and Microsoft Excel, and significant was set at a p inferior to 0.05. To assess changes in the variables across intensity domains, we employed a 2-factor repeated measures ANOVA. To compare physiological variables at each time point during each session, we employed a 1-factor ANOVA with normalized data. The effect size index was omega squared. We performed orthogonal post-hoc analysis. We calculated also the mean difference with 95% of confidence interval, and Cohen's d was selected as the standardized effect size. For Cohen's d interpretation, we follow Cohen 2013. Then, regarding monitoring utility assessment, to evaluate the percentage time spent in the target zone, we employed a 1-factor ANOVA depending on the distribution method with von Ferroni post-hoc analysis. And to assess differences in zone allocation across threshold methods, we employed the Friedman test. On the slide, you can see the demographic data of the participants who were the same as for the first study. And the session average duration varied depending on the intensity of the session. For the moderate session, all of the participants achieved the 60 minutes permitted. And for heavy and severe sessions, some of them could not perform the 60 minutes, and the mean average time and the mean time was 55 minutes for heavy session and 13 minutes for severe session. Starting with the results, on the slide you can see the different behavior of each variable in each of the sessions, so that the blue line is the moderate session, the green line is the heavy session, and the red line is the severe session. On the left part you can see the heart rate, on the right the oxygen uptake, the blood lactate concentration, and finally the FA-alpha-1. That is also colored the different domains corresponding to blue moderate, heavy is green, and red for severe. Focusing on DFA-alpha-1 results, what we found is that in the moderate domain, DFA-alpha-1 values typically remain high and above 1, a value of 1, and stable, despite that we did find a cardiovascular drift. On the upper part of each graph, you can see the significant differences. The N correspond to differences with the previous time point on the moderate domain, and the H and the S, the same analysis, but for the heavy or the severe domain. And then, focusing on the heavy and severe domains in DFA-alpha-1, we can see that there is a decline towards 0.75 in the heavy domain and a decline towards 0.5 in the severe domain as duration keep accumulating. And what I want to focus is that until the second quarter of the session, they did not achieve the corresponding domain for the session. Now, with the further analysis, I'll keep explaining this point. On this part, we can see the analysis of the normalized data to compare between variables in each of the sessions. For the moderate, heavy, and severe domains, we can see that there is a domain-consistent evolution between all the variables, and that we can only find significant differences in the baseline moment and in the first quarter for the severe session, but it is between traditional thresholds, not between traditional markers, not between DFA-alpha-1 and lactate or oxygen uptake. Regarding the results of the percentage of time spent in each intensity zone for the moderate, heavy, and severe, here zone 1 corresponds to the color blue, zone 2 to green, and zone 3 to the red color. What we can see is that for the moderate session, DFA-alpha-1 zoning yielded the highest time in zone percentages. It is the 2 bars on the right part of the graph. These methods accounted for more than 94% of the time in the intended domain, and the heavy and severe sessions, yielded to higher discrepancies when we use the DFA-alpha-1 method to define these zones, and the most significant were found in the heavy session. We can find some differences also in the severe session, but what we can see is that in the head, for example, we achieve less time in the intended domain, in the green domain in this case, that is zone 2, and that in severe domain, also not as significant, the time spent in the intended domain, in this case the red domain, it is also lower in some cases when compared with traditional thresholds definition of zones. These results that I have explained could be better understood with this part also, when we can see is the analysis of the number of participants who were allocated in the correct domain in each of the sessions. In this case, it's moderate session, the first, the second, the third, and the fourth quarter. We can see that there are no differences between methods in allocating participants in the intended zone, although in the fourth quarter, we can see that DFA-alpha-1 method, that in the fourth quarter, DFA-alpha-1 method yielded to higher and significantly different number of participants than the VO2 related heart rate data. So ventilatory thresholds with heart rate data associated method. It was the only significant difference between methods, and because DFA-alpha-1 method achieved more participants in the intended domain. Now, starting with the heavy session, we can see here that there is more variability. There are significant differences in the first part of the session. We can see that DFA-alpha-1 methods, absolute values and heart rate associated values present significant differences because they allocate less participants than traditional methods in this part, but beyond this point. For the third and the fourth quarter, there are no more significant differences, although we can see that still the DFA-1 methods allocate less participants than the traditional threshold methods to define zones. This temporal delay aligns with previous literature and shows that DFA-1 is not showing an immediate state of the load, but the accumulation of the stress along over time during the session. In the severe results, the results are very similar for heavy session, but with less significant differences for the first part again. But beyond this second quarter, we can't find any more significant difference. And still, in the first part, it is less number of participants allocated in the correct domain. This is due to this temporal delay that we also find in this heavy to severe range, where we find this higher inter-individual variability when we use the DFA-1 methods. Before getting through the conclusions, I wanted to present also the limitations that we found during the research process. First, the sample size and composition. We had modest cohorts and male predominance, who may limit the generalizability of the results, and sex-specific inferences could not be performed due to this limited sample. For example, for first study, we did calculate the post-hoc power analysis, and we find good results to enhance the validity of our results, but still it's something to have to take into consideration. Then exercise modality and protocols. Our results are all derived from cycling, so that different protocols or different modalities could affect the threshold detection and also affect, of course, to the comparability between methods. There is also a methodological dependency when we assess HRV data. We know R quality, sampling rate, artifact handling, determining parameters, and even device-specific effects are going to affect to the HRV data that we are recording. The strength of our work is that we use a high sampling rate electrocardiogram to try to avoid these problems. In chronic heart failure populations, we find a clinical heterogeneity that needs to be considered with variability in disease severity and in the use of medications that could be affecting the results and the estimates, of course. But as the sample was modest, we could not perform a medication stratified analysis. Also, in this population, there was a failure to determine valid thresholds in some of the patients, not only for HRV methods, also for ventilatory methods. And this is an acknowledged challenge in clinical CPETs that is reported recently by Kerr and colleagues in 2024. And finally, there were physiological factors that we could not control. For example, the muscle glycogen or the hydration status were not assessed, and that could be affecting the lactate comparisons. Now I will proceed to read the conclusions of the thesis. On the right part of the slide, you can see if the conclusion is according or not to the previous hypothesis. First, HRV-1 and HRV-2 show moderate to strong agreement with ventilatory and lactate thresholds in untrained healthy adults, supporting DFA-1 as a non-invasive, accessible, and cost-effective method for threshold determination. In chronic heart failure patients, HRV-1 shows low to moderate correlations with VT1, while limits of agreement and a tendency to overestimate VT1, so that its standalone applicability is limited in this population until larger studies clarify protocols and method refinements that improve the precision of the estimates. HRV-1 should be applied cautiously and alongside traditional maximal markers. Also in this population, HRV-2 shows a strong agreement with VT2, supporting its potential as a complementary low-cost surrogate to define the heavy severe boundary, especially when CPET is unavailable. Clinicians may consider using HRV-2 to individualize high-intensity interval training, monitor active intensity during sessions, and adjust home-based programs, although large validation studies are needed therefore it can be considered as a substitute for CPET. Expressing thresholds in power output generally yields stronger agreement and higher reliability than heart rate and comparable performance to oxygen uptake. Then power output should be prioritized when feasible for practical prescription. From all of these conclusions, only the second conclusion did not align with or get in accordance with our previous hypothesis. Continuing, HRV thresholds based on DFA-alpha-1 show good method comparable between their reliability, supporting their use for longitudinal monitoring across training periods and exercise programs. DFA-alpha-1 dynamics are particularly suitable for monitoring internal load in the moderate domain, providing a dimensionless integrative measure of systemic stress. Its non-invasive nature and compatibility with validating wearables strengthen its translational potential for field and home-based use. The continued decline of DFA-alpha-1 at heavy and severe intensities indicates sensitivity not only to intensity but also to exercise duration and accumulated fatigue, distinguishing it from common indices. DFA-alpha-1 shows potential as a biomarker of durability, offering insight into an individual's capacity to tolerate prolonged stress and supporting fine individualization of endurance programming. And the last conclusion, because DFA-alpha-1 kinetics are inter-individual and time-dependent, fixed absolute cutoffs shall not be used in isolation for heavy or severe prescription. In untrainables, delayed DFA-alpha-1 responses at the onset of constant load work in these domains may overdose internal load if targets are enforced too early. Then a hybrid approach is therefore recommended, combining different markers. Before ending the presentation, I wanted to provide some practical applications and the future research directions, starting with the practical applications. DFA-alpha-1 allows for an individualized prescription with accessible tools. We could use the first HRV threshold with DFA-alpha-1 to set the upper limit of the moderate domain, and the second HRV threshold to define the transition to the severe domain that would reflect in this three-zone model that is usually used in the practical settings. Then we have to consider to use power output values because they have shown high reliability and practical execution. When we assess, when we use external markers, we can find this better agreement. And the DFA-alpha-1 method, importantly, enables field tests. Here on the slide, I present two articles that validate different devices for the assessment of DFA-alpha-1 during exercise. The polar H10 sensor has been validated for these measures, and recently the mobile app FatMaxer has been also validated and provides a direct feedback on DFA-alpha-1 values. There are also other devices that enable to get DFA-alpha-1 feedback. For example, Garmin has alpha HRV, although still not validated. These devices are important because it is what allows for real-time monitoring. It has been shown that DFA-alpha-1 could be used as a primary monitoring tool for the moderate domain, so that if we maintain DFA-alpha-1 stable and above values of 1.0, we could avoid the overtraining and optimize the low-intensity sessions. Now think about the polarized training model, for example, who many athletes, not only elite athletes, but also recreational athletes, use for the distribution of the training intensity. More than 70% of the time is spent in the moderate intensity domain. So DFA-alpha-1 value will suppose an advantage and an accessible tool to measure a big part of the total volume of these sessions. Then, if we want to use it in the heavy and severe domain, we have to consider that it is going to be a delayed response in these domains. And when we monitor training, we have to take into consideration this point to avoid the overload of, especially the first part of the session. And then we could also use the decay of DFA-alpha-1 during prolonged sessions to assess durability, as it has shown to be time and intensity dependent. In clinical context, we can use HRV-2 as an accessible low-cost surrogate for the second intensity threshold and use it to individualize the high-intensity interval training prescription, as I have mentioned before. DFA alpha-1 methods also importantly enables for periodic re-evaluations. That is essential for safe progressions and to adjust the intensity of the exercise programs. I think that in the hospital, in the clinical routine, the resources and the time is very limited, and in these patients tend to be evaluated once already, no more, so that this method could suppose an advancement in the re-evaluation during the exercise training program, and it is easy to use and accessible. And then we could also use DFA alpha-1 in this population to monitor training intensity and detect unintended systemic stress. Now I finish with the future research directions. First, I think that studies should focus also in longitudinal training studies which assess if the HRV changes are comparable to the traditional ventilatory or lactate threshold adaptations, and if they can be used to predict the performance gains. Then to use it for prescription, there are some studies that have applied the HRV thresholds for prescription, but we need more studies in this context. Then, of course, assessing reliability in other populations, in clinical populations, in our case, in chronic heart failure patients, and to perform stratified validation, considering medication, disease severity, sex, cardiorespiratory fitness. There's a little bit in the literature, but still very scarce. Then something that has been proposed in literature, but still not well defined, is to use a multimodal integration, combining non-invasive approaches to improve the domain classification, DFA alpha-1 with other indexes. Of course, we have these wearables that can measure DFA alpha-1 to perform ecological validation with these variables in field and home settings. And lastly, to use DFA alpha-1 criteria for drift, for fatigue, for durability assessment in the different domains, and with different modalities and contexts. To end this presentation, I would like to say some words in Spanish if the evaluation committee agrees, to say thank you to my family, to my colleagues and friends.
Let's go ahead.
Bueno, ahora hablo un poquito en español. Y en un intento de no emocionarme mucho, voy a intentar ser muy breve. Bueno, empezar, por supuesto, por mis directores. Empezar con mi director, José Manuel Sarabia. Incluso si tuviera más tiempo no sabría ni por dónde empezar. Así que gracias por todo, gracias por tu apoyo, por ser una guía, tanto en lo profesional como en lo personal. Y desde ya te doy las gracias por todo lo que sé que vendrá. Y así que un gracias enorme para ti, y luego continuar con mi codirector, con Manuel Moya, Manolo para los amigos. Darte las gracias por confiar en mí y en mi trabajo, porque todos sabemos que hacer una tesis doctoral sin financiación es muy complicado y gracias a tu apoyo pude conseguir esa financiación, así que siempre te estaré agradecida y por estar siempre disponible para lo que haga falta. Continuando haciendo extensivo el agradecimiento al resto de compañeros del CIR, que al final es un sitio donde da gusto ir a trabajar y no se basa solo en esas relaciones, vamos a decir, laborales o profesionales, sino también en... Veo a gente con la lagrimilla en el ojo sino también en esa parte más social, que si te quedas a comer da gusto, que no pasa nada, que tienes con quien compartir también esa parte. Y terminar con la sala de becarios. Con la sala de becarios, que al final son con los que he compartido más mi día a día. No quería emocionarme. Y bueno, más allá de los ratitos también profesionales, congresos, etcétera, pues también os habéis convertido en una parte muy importante de mi vida personal, así que gracias. Y aunque en estas fotos obviamente no aparecen porque me he limitado un poco a la parte laboral, a mi familia, y decirles esta parte más que la exposición. A mi familia, gracias por todo. por apoyarme en todo, en todos los ámbitos de mi vida. Vosotros sabéis que no siempre ha sido fácil llevarlo todo, así que gracias por apoyarme y todo lo que consiga va a ser siempre gracias a vosotros. ¡Uf! He conseguido. With this, I finish my presentation, and I will be very pleased to listen to your feedback and interactions, and thank you so much for being here today and wanting to share this presentation and this moment with me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Noemí, for this presentation, for the perfect time management. 59 minutes, you got 60, you used 59. And before we move to the next part, then I will open the questions to the floor to the people who have a PhD.